Greetings, everybody. It's nice to imagine you out there. And I'd like to welcome you all to Marine Money's first Green New Deal webinar. Thank you, Peter Scharf. And the start of our last webinar series at the end of this most peculiar year. I hope all of you listening and all of yours are well, and that this month will provide as much joy and pleasure as it often does. Our industry, almost uniquely among industries, has its own global regulating body. And while we wait for the IMO to offer up a global level playing field carbon regulation to assist the industry tackle zero emissions transition, we thought this morning and over the next 3 webinars to celebrate some of what our industry is doing voluntarily, left to its own devices. And the truth is, our industry's efforts are a shining example in this challenging year of what voluntary actions by individuals and businesses may do to help combat climate change. As an industry, we are tackling our carbon footprint with technology, operational changes, a range of commercial steps from the Poseidon Principles and Sea Cargo Charter. And today, we'll look at the role a carbon market might play. So with us today, we have Jody Manning from the not-for-profit carbon offset initiative, Cool Effect, which gave me the high honor of closing the NASDAQ on their behalf last year. I encourage everyone listening to visit www.cooleffect.org. In its brief 5 years of existence, Cool Effect has assisted thousands of individuals, small and large businesses, augment their physical carbon reduction steps with quality offsets. Jody describes her role at Cool Effect as being an educator, a bridge helping individuals and companies take the voluntary steps which collectively, like the wings of a million individual butterflies, can help change the arc of history and our world. But before we get to Jody, we are delighted to present a brief interview conducted in Hong Kong by Marine Money's Andrew Oates with William Fairclough, Managing Director at Hua Kwong, a company whose own carbon offset announcement is just the sort of individual step we will be applauding in the months and the years ahead at Marine Money. We firmly believe that those businesses that take the lead in the transition to zero will be the great businesses to invest in, finance, and work with going forward. When we come back, Jody will work her magic and explain not just today's voluntary carbon market, but show us all how it can be a part of our arsenals in the great effort, how carbon can be done correctly. And now, William Fairclough and Hua Kwong. Thank you.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Marine Money webinar today, where I'm joined by William Fairclough, Managing Director of Hua Kwong Maritime Transport Holdings, who will be speaking to us about Hua Kwong's pioneering MOU with CLP Holdings Limited to promote carbon offsetting and help raise awareness of decarbonization in the shipping industry. As many of you know, the CLP Group is one of the largest investor-owned power businesses in Asia Pacific, with investments spanning across the Hong Kong, mainland China, India, Southeast Asia, Taiwan, and Australia. Hong Kong-listed CLP Holdings Limited is the holding company for the CLP Group, which has a diversified portfolio of generating assets that uses a wide range of fuels, including coal, gas, nuclear, and renewable sources. Established in 1952, Hua Kwong is one of the leading independent shipping brands based in Hong Kong with a global outlook. As part of the MOU agreement with CLP Holdings, Hua Kwong will purchase carbon credits from CLP to offset the carbon emissions of its business and fuel it purchases for its fleet. In addition, the MOU will enable the two parties to develop new service offerings using CLP carbon credits to meet the potential needs of other shipping companies to offset emissions and lower their carbon footprint. The CLP Carbon Credits platform allows users located anywhere in the world to calculate their carbon emissions and purchase carbon credits generated by CLP's wind farms in India. It is part of Smart Energy Connect, a digital solutions platform launched by CLP in 2019 to offer businesses and organizations a diverse selection of digital energy technologies and solutions. William relocated from the UK to Hong Kong in 2002 when he joined Clarksons Asia, and worked in various roles as a chartering broker, sales and purchase broker, and for the group's in-house ship owning and logistics arm. In 2006, William left Clarksons to become a director and co-founder of the Hong Kong-based ship owner Mandarin Shipping Limited. And in 2016, William was appointed Chief Commercial Officer of Wakwang Maritime Transport Holdings Limited and elected to the board. In 2019, he took the role of managing director, responsible for the group's ship owning activities. So William, thank you very much for being with us today.
Thanks, Andrew. Thanks for having me.
So to kick off, I'm going to go straight to it. Our first question is, carbon offsets have been a part of air travel for some time, and individual consumers have been able to offset their travel. But what motivated Wakwang, a bulk ship owner, to enter this market?
In fact, the shipping industry could go carbon neutral tomorrow using offsets as a mechanism for this. And of course, the whole offset market is something that's been around for a bit. It's come and gone. It's can be quite an emotive issue, but fundamentally, what's changing very quickly in the world at the moment is the efficacy, the efficiency, the size of the carbon credit market. And you've got Mark Carney, who used to be governor of the Bank of England, who's now the UN envoy for climate change, special envoy for climate change. And one of his primary tasks is developing a much bigger, more substantial carbon credit market. And we've long felt that the only way we're going to accelerate the change, especially for shipping, but just generally within the world, is to put a proper price on carbon. And carbon emissions should come at a cost. I mean, I firmly believe that's the way in which you will start to incentivize the development of alternative technologies. But at the same time, a proper carbon credit scheme, and as the market grows, then shipping could offset all of its emissions, as I say, almost immediately. And with a proper scheme, that money is basically financing low carbon, zero carbon, carbon capture technologies in other areas. And that is something we can do today, as we all agree we move to what ultimately is a zero carbon form of propulsion. But we know the debates are endless about what that will be and how long it's going to take. And we just felt there's probably something that we should be doing now. And that was really the start of our process. And the more we've looked at it, the more sort of convinced we are that I think shipping has a role to play in communicating its role to the wider consumer economy, in fact. And that is starting to happen, I think, at the consumer end, with much more sort of consumer activism towards wanting to know what the carbon footprint is of the goods that they consume, what the supply chain is. And as you look at the line of business, then they're much closer to the consumer, and that's starting to come in. But from the other end of the spectrum, where you're sort of shipping iron ore from Brazil to China into a steel mill, that's still quite a long way. And we felt actually there's just equally as an important role for shipping at all layers of the supply chain to measure. We've got to all measure much more accurately what our emissions are, and then taking what steps we can to to offset that now, and also put in place a platform which enables that to go all the way up the chain through to the consumer. And I think that's where the big challenge is, and that's part of what the communication sort of part of all of this is.
So the second question is a little bit about the deal and the relationship between Wakwang and CLP. So once you made the decision to offset your emissions, what process did you follow to get to CLP? Did you use a broker? How is the pricing determined?
What we found in CLP was a company that really was thinking in quite an industrial scale, and the attraction for them was they didn't have much of a sort of a footprint within shipping, but obviously shipping is one of the potentially large markets that could be very suitable for the carbon offsets that they generate. And so both of us being fairly old Hong Kong companies, they've been in Hong Kong much longer than us even, and there was just a very sort of good corporate understanding and communication that actually Hong Kong has a role to play as well. And I believe that Hong Kong does have a role to play as a sort of bridge between sort of Western mentality, and China have obviously been very proactive in their stance towards carbon neutrality by 2060. But the carbon offset market in China has been slightly ring-fenced, slightly different. And again, Hong Kong finds itself sitting in the middle. And I think then it helped that we were in the same city. But actually, their longer-term goals, matched ours in terms of really being able to roll out something on a fairly major scale. And we own roughly about 20 ships, work with a number of joint ventures, and operate through our ship management about 50 ships. It's a much bigger scope 3 emissions, if you like, is the emissions from all of our ships, but we're not responsible for those. And what we felt at least we could do is provide quite a competitive platform to offer to our time charterers the ability or the option of offsetting each particular voyage should they wish to, and the technology will play a big part in that. And I think that's why it's such an energizing discussion at the moment. It's because we have the means, with technology and using sort of blockchain technology as an example, where you can actually track through a proper sort of electronic ledger the whole supply chain, and you can then start to price it and actually break it up. And I think that's why it's really quite an exciting time to be trying to drive these type of things forward.
I think you're right that being able to measure carbon emissions is a key factor in being able to also reduce it. So having tackled your offsets through the voluntary carbon market, today there's all sorts of talk about a regulated or compliance carbon market developing, which would include shipping and carbon taxes. What is the role that carbon offsets might play going forward, both for your company, for Wakwang particularly, and also for the industry as a whole?
The message has been this needs to be a global solution. I think having a regional solution, is only it's not really going to work. And I think the issues we have dealing with governments and through the IMO is obviously it becomes a political process, and that takes time. I think the IMO play a crucial role in setting the overall carbon budget, if you like, for us as an industry, and I think that will start to tighten. But I'm a great believer that the market, once you have a budget of available carbon within a certain time frame, and as you move closer to that budget gets restricted and the cost of carbon goes up, that ultimately will provide the incentive for the development of the low carbon technology. I think the free market has a very important role to play.
Thanks. So just a final question before we wrap up. For the carbon skeptics out there, could you share some of what makes Wakwang a committed leader in this field?
I love that. Yeah, I'm intrigued by the term carbon skeptic, because I'm not quite sure what it means. But there's a great cartoon by the US cartoonist Joel Pitt for USA Today, which you may have seen, you may have heard of. I think American listeners will probably be familiar with it. And it depicts a climate summit, and there's a man on the stage talking about energy independence, preserving the rainforests, sustainability, green jobs, livable cities, all these objectives, renewables, clean water, healthy children. And there's a chap, Wag, stands up, at the back of the hall and says, yeah, but what if it's a big hoax and we create a better world for nothing? And, I just think that sums it up now. I mean, a sort of carbon skeptic, to me, I think those, the moment has passed. I think irrelevant of what your stance is towards the science. And I think the science we can now say is irrefutable. And I think what we can say is that society and the financial institutions representing the absolute lion's share of assets under management of capital that will be coming into the industry, both as equity and as debt, are all working towards a common goal here. Decarbonisation is absolutely central. It's so important. There's a sense of urgency now that has obviously been, I think, energized by the pandemic, and where that genie's well and truly out of the bottle. So I think that there's your stance on whether this is ethically a good or bad thing. As I said earlier, though, this is just good, also very sensible business. And to ignore what's happening now, I think you do so at your peril. I happen to be very passionate that we need to do as much as we can in as short a time as possible, and we need to be very practical about what we're looking to do. And the cost of carbon, emitting carbon, from a coal powered fire station, has had no cost to it. The externality has been priced at zero. And I think fundamentally that is wrong. And the insurance industry is waking up to that. I mean, the whole economy, the whole world really is waking up to the cost of doing nothing. And actually what we're seeing is just that things are being priced logically and fairly. And the carbon that we all emit is obviously has an effect. We've acknowledged that we've tried to quantify now what the effect is, and it will now, I think, over the next few years very quickly move towards a much more transparent, fairly priced market, and it will become central to all of our decision making, certainly in terms of capital allocation. And so we're very much of the view that by trying to be as proactive as possible at this stage, then we can really have as much of an impact as we can, and mitigate the effect on our business. I mean, let's not pretend, we own a fleet of ships that trundle around the world emitting large quantities of CO2, carrying all sorts of different cargoes, and shipping is not going anywhere. It's not disappearing, but it really needs to engage with outside of shipping. It needs to engage with the whole sort of ultimately the consumer, in my belief. That's really what we want to try and achieve, is for a very business to business industry. We want to try and engage much more with the consumer and the generation who really are entering the workforce now, and the slightly younger generation to whom this is just so obvious. It's so frustrating that nothing has been done quicker. And just to say, look, we are all working towards the same goal. And that is really for us quite energizing, because it's how this has all sort of come together.
Thank you very much, Will, for being with us today, and also for taking us through the details, the intentions, and the ambitions of the deal, but also your thoughts on Wak Wong's stance on climate change and the direction of travel going forward. We at Marine Money, we love to celebrate pioneering deals, and we really hope that this transaction with CLP will prove a positive example for the industry in the months and years ahead, and maybe even lay the groundwork for other companies to follow. So thank you again, Will, for being with us. Goodbye for now.
Thanks very much, Andrew. It's my pleasure. We'll talk soon. Thanks a lot.
Well, Will and Andrew, thank you both very much for taking the time to put that interview together. And a particular thanks on behalf of, I think, a grateful world, in fact, to the entire team at Wak Wong for taking the important step. Now, before I turn you over to the star of the show, Jody Manning of Cool Effect, I would like to remind everyone that you can ask questions by typing in your question into the GoToWebinar dialog box, which you should find on the right-hand side of your screen. Then at the conclusion of Jody's remarks, Marine Money's John Chia will put them to Jody on your behalf. So Jody, without further ado, the floor is yours. And I just want to say right up front, thank you and your entire organizations for what you do and for being here now with us. So Jody, thanks. It's lovely to see you.
Jim, thank you so much. And to thank everyone for being here today. Climate is such an important issue. And I'm just so thrilled to be able to be here to at least entertain a dialogue, because the most important thing that we do is we get started. My hope for today is to provide some of the basic nomenclature, because it's a very confusing market. And then also briefly discuss the differences between the compliance and the voluntary market, because I think it's going to be hugely important to many of you. I will tell you up front, there's a lot of things that continue to evolve, but let's talk about where things stand today and how it can be effective and impactful for your specific business. So as I mentioned, let's start with some of the basics, just so we have all of the same baseline to start with. Not surprisingly, you guys have heard a lot about climate.
Jody, sorry to interrupt, Jody. Your webcam is not live. I sent you a webcam request just so you can see that. Oh, there you are. Perfect. As you were.
Thank you so much. And may I ask, can you see the screen?
Yes, we can.
Oh, very good. My apologies for the technical difficulties. I get so fired up when I talk about climate that sometimes I forget the basic parts of the technology. All right, so back to the presentation. As you're all well aware, the reason that you're here is that our climate is certainly being impacted on a daily basis. All of this started, not surprisingly, again, during the Industrial Revolution. And as Mr. Fairclough mentioned, this is a global problem. There are certainly countries, individuals, and different types of businesses that are contributing to the problem, but ultimately the solution has to rely on a global problem. So a few of the things that do actually matter is how we measure our emissions. The first piece of information I want to leave you with is that carbon credits and carbon footprints do have one consistent metric, and that is a metric ton. So when we refer to greenhouse gases and we refer to carbon, it is oftentimes a basket of gases, whether it's carbon dioxide, nitrous, or methane. Those are all some of the big ones. The reason that we measure in metric tons is so that there is a universal language of it. We often tell people who, especially in the States where we're not as familiar with metrics, that a metric ton is about the size of a 2-story house. A lot of people then want to understand, well, what actually consists of emissions of a metric ton? Well, as many of you are aware, flying is one of the big contributors to carbon emissions. So a round trip from San Francisco to New York in business class is about 1 metric ton. And a person working from a home office for about 10 months is also emitting about 1 metric ton. And the reason that we talk about metric tons and we say that every single ton matters is because of this reason. About 1 metric ton destroys 544 square feet of Arctic ice every year. So when we say every ton matters, we truly mean every ton matters. In the shipping industry, it is a high polluting industry, but it's also not going anywhere. And just like many other industries, you're doing a lot to already try to reduce. I hear stories every day of, new technologies being built, new types of regulations that are being enforced, and just voluntary policies, which are the most important thing. But some emissions are inevitable to you getting your job done and to business continuing to happen. So in a global economy, this is where carbon offsets, a really high quality carbon offset, can actually help to neutralize unavoidable emissions. So let's talk about what a carbon offset is, and very specifically what makes a high quality carbon offset. Cool Effect is a 501c3. We came into play about 5 years ago because our founders saw a really deep divide between individuals and organizations wanting to do the right thing, but not really having the tools or the knowledge to navigate the process. I think every company who makes a voluntary commitment to reducing carbon emissions and to eventually using offsets, they want to do the right thing. But there is a lot of reputational risk because we're not really sure what is high quality and what is actually going to help. So carbon offsets at their basic core, they compensate for the impact of greenhouse gas emissions in another place. One point to remember is some people refer to them as carbon offsets, some call them carbon credits. For the most part, there is some legal language around them, but for the most part, most people and businesses use those terms interchangeably. Carbon emissions, as we've discussed, are measured in metric tons. And so many times it is actually carbon dioxide, but we refer to it as carbon dioxide equivalents because of the fact that it could be nitrous or it could be methane. So the first most important part, obviously, is determine the number of tons. So once you determine your emissions, we want to make sure that you do everything you possibly can to actually reduce. And this is where the great stories come in. There's a lot of truly innovative things that businesses are doing. Then the second thing to do is to consider the purchase of an equal number of tons that equates to the emissions that cannot otherwise be reduced. One thing I do want to keep in mind is that geography doesn't matter. Earth just wants the carbon to be reduced. Earth does not care where the carbon is reduced. We get a lot of business who come to us and say, we want to local this or we want to local that. It doesn't really matter. But what does matter is the quality of the carbon. We want to make sure that it's truly being reduced. All right, so let's talk about the two different types of carbon markets. There's the compliance market and there's the voluntary market. Cool Effect plays in the voluntary market. Now, but I will give a few comments about compliance first. What I will tell you is that it's an ever-changing discussion. There's a lot of confusion, not just for the shipping industry, but for every industry. There's regulations, there's taxes, there's just so many different things that are in motion right now, even politics. There's a lot of businesses, again, that are really just trying to navigate what must be done, what is the right thing to do, not only for their business, but also for the environment. And then what might be the right communication or right for their business DNA. So in the compliance market, this is really highly regulated. It is industries and countries for the most part, and they buy compliance credits if it's required by law. So a basic example is your business may be given a quote unquote quota of 1,000 metric tons of emissions. So your business, if they emit 900 tons, then they're going to be awarded 100 tons that they can sell. If they emit 1,100 tons, then they're going to have to buy 100 tons. So they're incented for their reductions. That's the basics of how the compliance market works. However, the regulations are all over the map. As you can see, the EU, and I'm sure many of you have seen this already, but the EU is trying to put together some building blocks that everybody can agree upon. Again, it's a global solution, but it's going to take years for them to get there. The second carbon market is the voluntary market, and this is where Cool Effect comes in. This is also the market that Mr. Fairclough was referring to. So as an industry or as a business, you may make some particular goals that are really specific to your need and your desire. So this is the voluntary market can be a very cost-effective way for you to reduce your Scope 3 emissions. So Scope 3 can be things such as operating costs, it can be corporate mandated travel, and it can be any emissions that you actually determine. But they are self-determined goals, and they're usually published on an annual basis. They can complement in phases such as offsetting business ops. You could even consider it one shipment, one ship, one voyage, or one container in your particular case. We work with a variety of different industries, and each business has their own type of scheme that they want to actually interact with. So carbon credits, where do they come from? Well, they come from high quality carbon projects. There are about 10,000 verified carbon projects that are listed on international registries. Once they're listed there, what our Cool Effect team does is we look at the project documentation. And what we try to do is determine which of those pieces are actually additional. What is in addition to a business as usual scenario? Cool Effect has a variety of different types of carbon projects. And the reason is because not one size fits all for our corporate buyers. So we have carbon avoidance, we have carbon sequestration, and there are some new developing methodologies in carbon that are soil, mangroves, some storage, but these are all removals. So these are actually drawing down different types of carbon gases. So what makes it, as I said, part of it is scientific. Carbon done correctly is what we call it. And it's an audit of the key documentation. True additionality means that without the demand for carbon credits, the project would not have been implemented. We also want to look at the finances. We want to make sure that the money is actually going to the project and not to the developer's pockets. We want to review the management structure. We want to talk to the local people. So in the days of non-COVID, we're really important. We're really committed to doing site visits and taking a look at all of our different projects because we consider them to be partners just as much as our buyers. Another thing that came out in the previous video is pricing. Pricing is really, really important. As a nonprofit, one of our missions is to make sure that we enable trust in the market, that you understand what you're paying and where your money is going, and then also that the project understands how we're representing it and that there's no slush in the middle. So when we say we are committed to our seller's pledge, this is the reason why. When we launched Cool Effect 5 years ago, we started to target individuals. What happened along the process of targeting individuals, which is another thing that Mr. Fairclough mentioned in reverse, individuals are employees and customers. And so businesses started to take notice. And businesses started to contact us because they wanted to bring it to their particular DNA, and they wanted to create certain voluntary goals as it pertained to climate. So Salesforce is one of our first partners. Twitter is another big partner. Twitter has an interesting story that's really about getting started. Twitter came to us and they wanted to offset their corporate mandated travel. Also in process of doing that, they decided that they wanted to offset their data centers. But what they really wanted to do was convert their data centers to solar power. But that wasn't going to happen immediately. So they implemented a 5-year plan. Again, this type of forward action and goal making applies in a lot of different places to a lot of different companies. So over the course of the 5 years, they will buy less carbon offsets from us because they are slowly converting their data centers to renewable energy. The New York Times Travel Desk is also one of our clients. They came to us literally for quotes in an article, and then unbeknownst to us, the Travel Desk offset all of their carbon using Cool Effect. This summer, we launched partnerships with the MLB and with American Airlines. So this is a whole variety outside of the shipping industry, but it's to show you that it's better to drink from the cup than the fire hose. It is better to get started and try to do something. Every industry is struggling with the regulations, but at the heart, most every industry and business wants to try to do something that verifiably contributes to the solution. So when we talk about carbon credits, you know, we will oftentimes get people who say, aren't carbon credits actually an excuse to pollute? Well, that is why the compliance market was born. It was born to give some responsibilities to the high polluting industries. However, carbon credits were the first one to say they're only a tool. They have to be high quality. They have to have secondary benefits. However, there's something that we can do right now. We can take action right now and have a measurable impact. They're also affordable. While they sort out all these regulations, there's a whole variety of different prices. You can also customize them. Again, the most important thing is to just get started. The biggest part of a high quality carbon offset is also a secondary benefit to the local people that it supports. There's health benefits, there's job creation, there's indigenous people and support of local culture. So we work with businesses who really have a specific story that they would like to tell. to make sure that they're working with carbon offsets that equate for them. When I started doing this presentation 3 years ago, this slide said we had 12 years left to make a difference. Unfortunately, that window is starting to close, and now we have 9 years before we see the harmful impacts, irreversible impacts of the damage that we may be doing to the clients. We have the tool right now, and Cool Effect is here to help you. Thank you.
Thank you, Jody. That was hugely enlightening, and thank you. I mean, I know that the rest of the audience, just judged by the questions that have come in, really enjoyed that. So thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and jump straight in, and if anybody has other questions, feel free to submit them through the chat box. But the first question was, you referred to reputational risks associated with the credit markets. What are those risks?
There are a lot of different risks. You have to make sure the first thing that you're doing is ensuring that it's a high quality credit in 2 ways. Scientifically, is it actually reducing a greenhouse gas? There are a tremendous amount of data and inputs that go into determining that, and you really need the proper documentation to understand that the carbon is actually being reduced. Some of the big things that we look for are longevity, permanence. We want to make sure it's a 40-year or a 100-year project. You don't want to go in and out of things. It's also, the second thing, again, it gets back to the finances. You want to make sure your dollar's going to make a difference. You want to make sure that the money's actually going to reduce more carbon and to supporting the actual activities of the project.
Great. Another question was, how many offset registries are there? Are there 2 or 3 that are internationally viewed as the best, such as, you know, gold standard or VCS?
There's about 8. There are, well, actually, there might be 10 now. I don't know that one is better than the other. I will tell you, Cool Effect is registry agnostic. And the reason is we're more interested in the project and the scientific documentation that comes from the project. We believe that there are some good projects. Carbon projects are on a spectrum. And so we believe that there's some really high quality projects and some that are not as high quality. Yes, the gold standard is very, very popular. Vera is very popular. In America, we have CAR, which is the California registry, and we have ACR, which is the American Carbon Registry. So there is a variety. A lot of it has to do too with technology. Some have retirement platforms that are incredibly automated, and some do it by hand, some of the smaller ones. But it's really more important, rather than the registry, to look at the scientific methodology.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So how should a ship owner choose a carbon offset broker / wholesaler? How are the services provided by a broker or wholesaler differentiated?
Well, first of all, you have to determine if it's a compliance or a voluntary carbon offset that you're looking for. Compliance, not surprisingly, is very regulated, and you have to go to one of the brokers or countries, basically, who sells the compliance credits. That's not what Cool Effect is. Then, if you're looking for voluntary, of course we think Cool Effect is the best. But there's different reasons to look for different types of, well, I'll use the word broker, even though as a nonprofit, I don't love being called a broker, but ultimately that is what we do because we represent carbon credits. You have to understand what type of documentation you're looking for. If you're looking for somebody who can really supply you with a year's worth of CDP documentation, that needs to be one of your requests up front. If you're looking for somebody to be a partner and help you find certain types of credits at a certain budget, right, then you need to make that requirement up front. we handle anything from really complicated RFPs all the way to people who really write to our info box every day and, you know, want to offset 100,000 tons. So the spectrum of buyers is all over the map. I will tell you that we recently did a survey to our business clientele, which is significantly large. And it didn't matter whether it was a Fortune 100 company or a small business. When we asked them 3 basic questions, they told us that the employees, the customers, and the stockholders were the ones driving their desire to explore the market, and that secondly, they were just getting started. So it was really important to us when we learned that everyone, no matter where you are, is just getting started. I think it's really important to communicate that with whomever you're going to work with, because you need somebody not only who's going to help you through this sale or purchase of your credits, but who's going to help you with communication afterwards. It is so important to be able to have the tools, whether you're communicating to your board, to your employees, to your customers, but you need tools to be able to communicate what your goal is, what you've done about it, and how that money is helping going forward.
That's fantastic. And you know, it's interesting that you were talking about process, because we've had quite a few questions that have come in about the process. So I'm going to try and wrap them all up into one. But like, you know, as a carbon buyer, you know, what is the process? You know, what is the time to completion fees? What does the buyer get at the end of the day after they purchase them? And you know, do you have an actual example of a project that the, you know, carbon credits would go towards as like an overall like process from beginning to end?
Yes, absolutely. Let me see if I can peel that onion back. Let's talk about process first. The first part of the process is establishing the footprint. So again, as I mentioned before, the most important thing is that you start somewhere. Many businesses get absolutely paralyzed by the footprint, because everybody comes in and they say, we want to do it all. We want to be able to pass along the cost to our customers, but we have to split it up like this. And this person doesn't want that. Don't get paralyzed by all of that. The more important thing is that you start somewhere. Footprint what you can. That could just be simply your business operations. That may be one voyage. That may be one container, but you have to start somewhere. And the reason that it's important to start somewhere is that you need to be able to communicate it, right? Because if you start trying to communicate your entire supply chain, you'll get shut down before you even begin. When we talk to companies, we actually encourage them to start with employee mandated travel. And that really applies to any business because employees fly around. And the reason is because it's measurable. And it's also a place, again, like I said, that you can get started with the process and familiarize yourself with how it works. But after you have your footprint, of course, we want you to do everything that you can to reduce. In many cases, companies have already done that before they even come to us. But once you've done those 2 things, then you're going to have a certain amount of metric tons that you want to offset. That's where we start the dialogue between what is the right project for you. If you need 100,000 tons, that's a different kind of buyer than needs 65 tons. Both of those are relevant, and a good carbon partner will help you with both of those. But you don't want to be pigeonholed into specific bundles. You don't want to be overwhelmed with options. You want somebody who's going to listen to what your goals are and the values of your company and present you with a right package that's going to work for you. Inevitably, budget comes into play. We are all businesses and we have to deal with that. But the good thing about carbon credits is there's a spectrum. You may want a mix of US projects, which are much more expensive than the developing world, but you may have a certain budget that you need to meet. And so that's where we put the proposals together. After you make the purchase, which is also a really easy process, there's one piece of paper that we ask our buyers to sign, and it's called a Verified Emissions Reduction Purchase Order, or affectionately known as a VERPA, which I still can't wrap my head around that language, but that's what it's called. And what that is basically a 30 or 60-day contract that secures the number of tons at the price so that we can arrange for the transfer of the money, because no business can just lay down a credit card the same day. It's just not like a retail purchase. So that's really the only thing. And then after the funds come in, Cool Effect retires the credits, and then you will receive a verification of that retirement. And that's really important for you, because you want to be able to, number one, ensure that the credits are not double counted, and number two, that the international registry has a record of your emission reduction.
Great. Sorry, that was a big one to tackle, so I apologize you walking us through all of that. Another question came in. Another question came in that said, some are hesitant to cross-subsidize industries via credit, i.e. they would prefer to see direct investment into maritime to reduce our emissions rather than pay for reductions elsewhere. What are your thoughts on cross-industry carbon reduction?
Oh, climate finance. I would group all of that in a terminology that we refer to as climate finance. Climate finance is equally as important, because without climate finance, we won't develop the new technologies. So think of it as two options, and we have companies that actually combine both. They use some funds to invest in climate finance, and they invest in new technology, but it is an investment. It can't be counted towards your emission reductions. And then they use carbon offsets as a way to meet their specific reduction targets. So it's really two groups of money. And you have to decide based on your business goals, which one is right for you.
Okay, and I mean, like a question that was similar to that was, are there any offsets available having to do with the ocean or coastal ecosystems that you're aware of right now? These would be better aligned with the space and shipping, et cetera.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Actually, this is one of the evolving types of methodologies that we're the most excited about. It's called blue carbon. So blue carbon can take the many different forms, but the projects that we're going to be representing in 2021 are actually projects that look to plant mangroves. Mangroves do two things. They protect the coastline from the rising sea, but they also absorb more carbon than a tree does. So it's developing right now, and it's definitely in need of finance, because if you think about the Amazon forest, right? There's a lot of trees there. We want to protect all of them. The Amazon is the lungs of the earth, right? We want to protect that. But they're issuing a tremendous amount of carbon credits because of the size, right? Because it's millions and millions of hectares. So they have millions of credits. Mangroves are smaller. So, but it's a developing technology. So right now, what we're trying to do is get to the funding that can help plant those. But yes, blue carbon is absolutely a big emphasis for 2021 for Cool Effect.
That's very exciting. One of the questions that just came in was, what experience have you had with public companies who make the decision to buy carbon credits? Who's making those decisions, and how do shareholders feel about it?
Well, most public companies, I'm going to use broad strokes here, but most public companies would be part of the compliance market. So utility companies, for example, governments, for example. We have had a lot of, we've done a lot of work with universities. And in some cases, those are public. In some cases, they're private. But by and large, again, in that particular space, it's employees and customers who, of course, if it's a public company, it's most likely the taxpayer. They're demanding that the company take accountability for their carbon. So it's viewed as a really positive communications tool.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. And I have one last question before I bring Jim Lawrence back in, and I'm sure he'll probably have some of his own, but it's around pricing. So somebody was just on cooleffect.org, and they said that you nominate a certain amount of money per ton. How do you define the amount of money for each project? I know this is a hot topic of pricing.
Yes, absolutely. Let me give you the top line of it though. There's largely 3 components that go into pricing. First of all, the voluntary market is not regulated, obviously. There's no police. There's no one monitoring it, which is why we're trying to bring pricing transparency to the market, because we believe that is one of the components of trust. So right now there's roughly 3 things. It's the area of the world. As I mentioned previously, for example, a project in the US is going to be more expensive, just like a white t-shirt or any other type of good. It's going to be more expensive than the developing world. And you'll also notice, whomever is on there, we don't have any projects in Europe. Europe is also a highly regulated market. They're ex-ante credits, not ex-post, which just generally means they're credits in the future, so they're not even available right now. And because of the demand for them, because there's not very many, they're incredibly expensive. Which brings me to the second piece, and probably the most important piece, which is supply and demand. It is a supply and demand market. So the more demand for the credits, the more likely that you're going to get a higher price. The third component is the number of credits available. I've already alluded to this as well. A forest, for example, will issue millions of credits because they have millions of acres, so they're reducing millions of tons. Whereas blue carbon or a cook stove or a biogas project, they're smaller. They have upfront costs to building that a forest wouldn't necessarily have. So there's not as many available. Again, that gets back, it's the type of project, but ultimately it also feeds into supply and demand as well. So what cooleffect does is once a project passes all of the scientific needs and meets our scientific evaluations, the project team will go in and they will negotiate price. So we use the power of our community, because we buy a lot of credits over the last 5 years, to negotiate bulk discounting. So whether you're buying 1 ton or 100,000 tons, there are those prices are reflected because we've used the power of the community and we pass it along on the website. Now, if you are looking to buy 10,000, 20,000, 50,000, 100,000 credits, we can sometimes get an additional bulk discount if it's a one-time purchase. So again, there's a lot of things that go into pricing, but the basics are they get back to supply and demand. It's very important that you ask not only what is your administration fee, but how much is the project actually getting? What you don't want to do is somebody who's buying a $1 credit and selling it for $2 and telling you that the admin cost is, 8% or 6% or whatever. You want to know exactly how much is going to the project.
Thank you for that. I know that's hugely complex. And I mean, based on the amount of questions that are coming in, which we're actually going to have to cut off, I can see that the audience is very appreciative of your time. And so those that still have questions that weren't answered, feel free to reach out to Jody at cooleffect, as they are not only great educators, but the leading company in the space. So now I'm going to hand it back to Jim Lawrence to wrap this up. Jim, are you still there?
Yeah, I am. Well, great, Jody. I'm looking forward to you working 36 hours a day for the to answer all the rest of these questions. Thank you.
To do that.
Yeah. Thank you very much. It really is a vocabulary. But what I think we all learned in school, right? You can master any language, but it's really a good teacher that makes you want to master it and brings it all alive. So thanks for bringing a complicated vocabulary to life for all of us. And I would urge, as John just said, everyone who has sort of follow-on questions, because it is complicated, to go to the cooleffect.org website, and you can, there's a wealth of information there. So just in wrapping up today, I want to express, once again, our thanks to Will and Wah Kwong, to Jody and Cool Effect for their support and participation today. And I want to remind everybody that on Wednesday, that's December 9th at 11:30, we're going to continue this examination of our industry's effort to get to zero by hearing from two extraordinarily talented companies, Wärtsilä and Marsoft Clean Co., and their efforts to help us physically reduce our carbon footprints. That's this coming Wednesday at 11:30. Jody, once again, thank you to you and your team at Cool Effect. Stay well, everybody, and see you soon, I hope.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.